Welcome everyone, please take a seat. Good morning, afternoon and evening. Today is November the 25th. For a reminder, for something I'm sure you all already know, today is the 531st anniversary of the ending of the Siege of Granada. This was the last of the fights of the Reconquista, a 700 plus years long struggle of Christian Spain to rid themselves of the Muslim Caliphate of Granada, which settled in Spain for hundreds of years. And with this win in the Siege of Granada, the Christians in Spain were able to retake control of their country. So, congratulations to all my Spanish friends who got back their country for today. However, some specs are not going to get back a few things in a few days once Dragonflight launches, and other specs will get something new in a few days. Why? Because we have yet another round of balance tuning. And likely this will be the last round of balance tuning before the expansion actually hits. Now, don't worry, you still have a good amount of time to make use of your copium tanks, because at the end of the day, the real season will come out December the 12th. So there is still time for Blizzard to apply changes before the serious part of the expansion comes out, but for now, this is what we can expect as the last changes before the expansion actually releases. So, to stay in line with the theme of today, we are starting with some nerfs, because we are starting with Havoc Demon Hunter. Havoc Demon Hunter, we have mentioned before, was one of the strongest, if not the, arguably, strongest melee DPS spec in the beta, so the nerfs were expected. However, perhaps these nerfs might prove to be a little bit harsher once we go deeper into the expansion, because the nerfs are particularly to their scaling, to how much more powerful can they get once they have more item level, more gear, and more power. The first part of the nerf isn't like that, it's a little bit more acceptable. It's a nerf to Burning Wound. The bonus damage of your Immolation Aura going from 50% to 40%, that's acceptable. What is a little bit harsher is the nerfs to Know Your Enemy and to Any Means Necessary. These two talents are the scaling buffs to Havoc. One gives you more critical damage based on your critical chance. It used to be at a 100% rate at rank 2, so if you have 50% crit, your crits do 50% more damage. That's the good scaling part of your talent, because as you go deeper into the expansion, you get more crit, and as you get more crit, you do more crit damage. It's very good for scaling, and this gets nerfed. Instead of 50% and 100% at rank 2, it's going to be 40 and 80%. So now, you're going to be gaining a bit less crit damage once you gain crit. The other nerf to your scaling was to Any Means Necessary. This was a double mastery, basically. Your current mastery gives you more damage to all of your chaos abilities, and this talent gave you your same mastery damage to every other one of your abilities that did not do chaos damage. So Immolation Aura and Sigil of Flame doing fire damage would be converted to work with your mastery. Elysian Decree, The Hunt, Fodder to the Flame, all these non-chaos damage abilities would also be gaining the damage buff of your mastery. That was the other good scaling point of Havoc, which also gets nerfed. Previously, this talent was giving you 100% of your mastery as damage conversion. Now it's only 80% of your mastery as damage conversion. So, as I said, these are scaling nerfs. These are nerfs that you will perhaps feel more as you go deeper into the expansion and gain more gear and gain more, in this case, crit and mastery. That's what's gonna be hit with these changes for Havoc. Now we have a few more nerfs, but perhaps these are going to be a little bit more liked by the player base. These are to Paladin, and I know, it's weird. It's not that Paladin as a class needed nerfs, right? You haven't really heard that much of an outcry about how OP Ret is, or how oppressive Prot Paladin is. They are not particularly strong right now in Dragonflight, but the nerf is to a part of their talent tree which has been lamented by quite a few players for being quite annoying, because it's the strongest part of their talent tree, but it's also frustrating to play with. I'm talking about the left side of the general Paladin tree. It's the side with Of Dusk and Dawn, your old Shadowlands legendary. At this point we can say old, I think. Your old Shadowlands legendary, and the follow-up improvement of Seal of Order. So, Of Dusk and Dawn was the legendary, and now is the talent which gives you a buff if you reach full holy power. So if you reach 5 holy power, you used to do more damage, and then if you reach 0 holy power, you take less damage. And then the power-up buff, Seal of Order, also gave you extra damage and healing to your spenders if you reached 5 Holy Power, also gave you faster CDR and a cooldown reduction to your Holy Power generating abilities if you reached 0 Holy Power. This was kind of annoying because the center and the right side of the tree of Paladin had, you know, more interesting and more fun stuff to go for, like Divine Purpose, you know, your free spender talent. The Med Paragon legendary was also there, Sanctified Wrath or Seraphim were also there, and yet you still had to go for this of Dusk and Dawn because it was just flat out stronger. So Blizzard is nerfing it, TLDR. The max Holy Power part of Dusk and Dawn goes from 6% damage increase to 5% damage increase, and the Seal of Order talent after this of Dusk and Dawn legendary also gives you less damage to your Holy Power spenders, from 10% damage bonus to 8% damage bonus. So even though it's a nerf, it's an attempt to make the other part of your talent tree for Paladin a little bit more desirable, since now this part, the left side of the Paladin tree, has been nerfed. Now, the other part is, however, a straight up buff, because this is a buff to Protection Paladin and to the self-healing, the self-sufficiency of a Protection Paladin, because Word of Glory is going to heal you for 40% more, only for Prot Paladins, and then Light of the Titans is going to heal you for 40% more. Now, this was very, very needed, because Prot Paladin was basically the least self-healing out of all the tanks. I'm sure you might already be familiar with the self-healing of a Blood Death Knight, right? That's very, very high. You might also be aware of the self-healing of a Vengeance Demon Hunter, which is on the high side, and maybe you weren't aware, but you will be aware in Dragonflight of the self-healing of the recently buffed Guardian Druid. That's also good. The self-healing of a Prot Paladin, however, was quite disappointing, which meant they had some trouble once they were getting to low HP. They had to rely a lot on their healer, sort of like a Brewmaster Monk. They were in a similar problematic situation when it came to getting out of trouble by themselves. I mean, if you just look at this is the average healing of a Prot Paladin's Word of Glory in Dragonflight at item level 400. It's an average of 100k healing, and this is the average healing of a regrowth of a Guardian Druid, which is 40% stronger. More or less the same amount that Word of Glory is getting buffed for. The other problem, of course, is that Word of Glory is the vast majority of the Prot Paladin's healing, whereas Regrowth doesn't even make it into the top 3 for Guardian Druid when it comes to healing, so it will likely still have issues, Prot Paladin is, but at the very least it's getting addressed to a degree. Then we have buffs. These were the buffs given to Discipline Priest, particularly to just one talent, Harsh Discipline. This was changed. Rather than proccing out of the amount of atonements you enable, it was getting procced by the amount of casts of your smite. It used to be 10 casts and then 5 casts to proc this. It was buffed to be only 8 casts and 4 casts, and now it's getting buffed in duration as well. It no longer lasts for 15 seconds, this buff, it lasts for 30 seconds. So you have a much larger window to make use of this buff, rather than the shorter 15-second window you had before. We then have a nerf, and this is a nerf also to a spec that was doing quite fine. No, it was not doing as fine as Havoc Demon Hunter, arguably not doing as fine as Windwalker Monk or even Frost Mage or even Demonology Warlock either, but it was doing very well. That's Outlaw. So the main source of damage, pretty much your spender, your dispatch, is getting a flat 5% damage nerf. Then there is also a nerf to your cooldown Dreadblades. Dreadblades used to last for 10 seconds and now it's gonna last for 8 seconds. And the energy cost reduction that you get when you use Dreadblades goes from 50 energy to 40 energy cost reduction from Dreadblades. Outlaw was also doing fine. If you ever had to put the spec on a scale and choose if you really wanted to, if you had to give them a buff or a nerf, then Outlaw was definitely on the nerf side of things. So this was also a needed nerf, although, as I said, not nearly as much as a few other specs, which are also inexplicably missing from today's list of balance tuning. We then close out with the last spec which will likely get changed before the release of the expansion, which is Arms. Much like the other specs I just mentioned, deserving nerfs like Outlaw and Havoc, same thing for Arms. If you put Arms on a scale and you really had to choose between a buff or a nerf, then the answer to Arms was definitely a buff. Arms was not poised to do too well, so pretty good amount of buffs to Arms Warrior. A few of them are going to be defensive only, like Seasoned Soldier now also grants you 10% reduced damage to AoE effects, or Fueled by Violence now heals you for 65% of the damage done by deep wounds instead of 50% damage done, as well as flat out damage increases. A 3.5% damage increase to Mortal Strike, which is your main source of damage. Also, a big help. I know it's not saying much because Arm's AoE is quite weak, but it's a big help as well in there with the buff to Battle Lord. Battle Lord now also increases the damage of your overpower by 25% at all times, which is a quite surprising change. It's a pretty big buff, which could be a talent point on its own, and instead now it's baked into Battle Lord for free for Arms Warrior. You then finish out with a few other things like Martial Prowess, giving you even more damage to Mortal Strike every stack, or Exhilarating Blows, giving you a higher chance to reset Mortal Strike or Cleave from 15 to 20%, and lastly, Fatal Mark. Your meme talent, which looks very cool, it reminds you of the Ink Pod trinket back from Eternal Palace, has gotten its damage increased by 20%. As I said, it's kind of a meme because it looks very cool once you read it, and it looks OP once you read it, but then you realize, for example, its uses in places like Mythic Plus where enemies die very quickly. You don't have a lot of time to make this talent work properly if the enemies die too quickly for you to get the stacks up. Likely for that, it's getting increased in damage by 20%. It's gonna be interesting to see if with this new set of significant buffs to arms, it will be enough to start making it a little bit more relevant. In the beta so far, what you have seen, if you looked at Warrior, the one that was clearly ahead between the two was Fury, definitely, which was doing quite fine. Arms, not nearly enough. Now, these would be all of the changes for today. However, I am also contractually obligated to point out the changes to PvP, of which I know tons about. The changes to PvP are exclusively to Rogue and are exclusively buffed. It's a revert of the effectiveness nerfs given to some of their abilities, like Recuperator, Echoing Reprimand, and Reverberation are no longer cut in PvP by 50% and 33%. Same goes for Outlaw. Outlaw gets Killing Spree no longer reduced by 20% in PvP, and Pistol Shot no longer reduced by 16% effectiveness in PvP. And lastly, Subtlety. Their mastery is no longer reduced by 20% in PvP as well. As I said, given my extreme knowledge of PvP, good, right? Rogue is B tier in PvP. It's doing fine, could have done better, a buff is okay. That's my statement about PvP. With this last thing being done, we are now finished with the balance tuning. As I said, it's likely it's going to be the last round of tuning before the release of the expansion. Also, as I said, not that it matters, because when you really want to test out the power of the specs will be from December the 12th onwards, so there is still time for Blizzard to apply changes to all of the different specs. But very likely, this is what we will have by the release of the expansion. So, for today, on this Friday, and on arguably the start of the weekend, as some claim, I think at the very least you have to wait past the afternoon of Friday to claim it a weekend, I believe. I think that's the unwritten rule. Anyways, it's time to leave for today. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of my Patreon supporters for contributing to the support and the help of this channel, and to myself as well. You can also help and show your support in other ways other than spending money, like liking and commenting down below on this video, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Those would help as well, without having to dish out the cash in any way. Lastly, of course, you can also find me to be followed, preferably but not stalked, on Twitter, as well as subscribing to my Patreon right over at these two links. And then as a last new entry, you can now also find me on Twitch. Generally speaking, trying to stream every day past 10 p.m. European time, 1 p.m. Pacific, and 4 p.m. Eastern. Those are usually the times I will be on at. With this said and done, it's time to leave. Thanks, of course, as usual, guys, for watching the video. See you guys soon, and in the meantime... Oh, nice. The video is ending, and the surprise allergy with a stealthy, itchy nose attack is not here. I'm fine. It's great.